All right, we're recording. All right, very good. Is that right? Is it the network connection in the library is bad? Is that what you mean? I couldn't connect. I couldn't get connected down in the classroom the other day. Hi. Oh, she was on for a second. Yeah. I don't know if it's where they have the access points or not. The other day, I couldn't get a connection here. Upstairs, I couldn't get one. It was you guys or one of my other classes was taking the exam. Gremlins. Savannah's having all kinds of troubles. All right, well, I got the recording going anyway. So let's go ahead and get started on Chapter 30. So Chapter 30 picks up kind of where we left off in Chapter 29. In Chapter 29, we were talking about the group of plants that we call the seedless plants, right? We haven't mentioned any seeds yet. When we talked about the mosses, when we talked about the ferns, talked about all the whisk ferns and all those, there was no seeds. Plenty of discussion about spores, right? That's what the little brown spots are on the back of the fern leaves. Those are the spore-producing structures. These organisms reproduce by spores, and then the spores germinate into the gametophyte, right, that multicellular part. And then the gametophyte, of course, grows and becomes this huge multicellular haploid structure that produces lots of gametes. But still no seeds, no seeds. Now, seeds were an evolutionary hallmark for plants because seeds seeds allowed plants to do what animals could do, what animals were allowed to do as they moved away from the cushier conditions around the shoreline, okay? As continents were forming and different habitats were forming, we had the habitats along the shoreline that were, they were wet and moist, tropical in some cases. But as you move further interior, as the continents began to develop, we got drier environments as well. And desiccation, as we talked about the other day, moving out onto land, that was one of the biggest problems that organisms have to deal with is drying out, desiccation on land. So what seeds have done for plants, hi, Savannah, I see that you finally were able to stay signed on. Good, good. So what seeds did for plants, folks, when we talk about animals later on, basically is the same thing that what we call the amniotic egg did for animals. And just as kind of a little foreshadowing or a little bit of peek into the future, you and I, us mammals, reptiles, birds, we have an amniotic egg. We have an egg that's floating in an amniotic sac, a sac full of amniotic fluid, which keeps the embryo moist. Again, it's delicate tissues of the developing embryo have to be kept moist. Drying out would be obviously detrimental. In the case of reptiles and birds and in case of mammals, the egg supplies that moisture, or in the case of mammals, the egg is actually retained inside the female. It's all about protection, right? Especially as we're dealing with harsher environments. Now, that's kind of what a seed does. A seed allowed plants to do basically what animals could do once they developed this amniotic sac, once they developed this egg that didn't have to be laid in water. Remember, one of the biggest distinctual differences between animals that lay eggs is the fact that you got the amphibians who have to lay their eggs in water. Remember, amphibians have a dual life. Amphibia actually means a dual life. They lay their eggs in water, they develop in water, and when they finally lose their tail and develop legs, then they move out onto land. And they can live on land, but they got to go back to water to lay eggs. You see, amphibians don't have an amniotic egg. They have an amniotic egg. All right, so an amniotic egg, or an egg without that embryonic fluid to protect them from drying out. Seeds are basically the same thing too. Seeds and seeded plants, like you see that holding in the hand of this person right here, seeds are a packaging, right? They protect the embryo, and in many cases, they provide a little bit of a starter pack of food to get the embryo going, right? So it's kind of like, again, interesting parallels to me all the time between the plants and the animals. It's kind of what the animals were doing as we moved from, laying a bunch of eggs and not caring about them to perhaps laying fewer eggs and providing some sort of maternal care, or the case of, like, if we think about mammals such as ourselves, having, not laying eggs, but having very few offspring, providing a lot of parental care. So these are actually seed plants of a very interesting plant here in Florida. These are seeds of the red mangrove. Red mangroves are those plants that grow along the shoreline. They have the big prop roots. And what's so interesting about these seeds is that red mangroves live in really harsh conditions. They live right on the edge of fresh and salt water. They live in brackish water. The conditions of their environment are constantly changing. Water's going in, water's flowing out, high tide, low tide. Sometimes it's saltier. Sometimes it's not as salty. If there's been a lot of rain, it's not going to be as salty. If there hasn't been a lot of rain, there's going to be a lot of evaporation. The salt's going to go up. So, I mean, this is a difficult environment to get a hold of. So the red mangroves have developed this technique by which they produce seeds that are actually ready to go. Many times in plants, seeds are kind of a dormant state, right? When you go to the store and you buy bags of beans, you're buying seeds. They're dormant. You let them sit in your cupboard forever, they would stay seeds forever. Now, if you gave them some moisture in the right conditions, they'd grow into a plant, wouldn't they? In the case of the red mangroves, because their seeds are, or because their conditions are harsh the way they are, they produce seeds that are practically ready to go instantly. We say that red mangroves are one of the only plants out there that engage in a type of reproduction that we call viviparity. Now, I'll talk about viviparity and types of reproduction later on in the animals, but I'll go ahead and introduce it to you now, at least so we have a framework. 3 basic ways in which animals reproduce, and we can use these terms in plants as well in some cases, is some animals lay eggs and they engage in oviparity. Reptiles, fish, amphibians, they all lay eggs. Some of us give birth to live young, mammals, right? Some species of fish, many species of shark. And then finally, there's one that's in between, which is, let me spell it before I mess it up. Ovoviviparous. I don't know if I spelled ovoviviparous. Yeah, that's it. Ovoviviparous. Ovoviviparous organisms lay an egg, but lay an egg internally. So the egg is laid inside the female, it hatches inside the female, and then the young are parturated or birthed from that point forward. You see, it's really nothing more than strategies to kind of give your young a leg up, a chance to survive. If you're oviparous and you lay eggs, especially in the case of like fish and some insects, you lay lots of eggs. You don't really care anything about them. You're laying lots of eggs because most of them aren't going to make it. Animals that give birth to live young, viviparity, again, are kind of like I was talking earlier. They're generally going to lay, or they're generally going to have fewer offspring because there's going to be a lot more parental care. Well, red mangroves are unique in their seeds because that seed, they're called mangrove pencils. You might actually see them floating at the beach sometime, and you can actually see that in the one at the top, the roots are already starting to form. These seeds are seeds like every other seeds, but they're a lot less dormant than, like, say, the bean seeds that you buy. Yeah, I got one for you. The bean seeds that you would buy at the store. So when these seeds drop off of the plant, we basically use the term viviparity to say, okay, that's not a gestating dormant seed. That thing is ready to go. And what they do is they float around until they reach just enough shallow water till those roots can take hold, and then they grow into a mangrove bush. Good example of an organism that's ovoviviparous, sand tiger sharks. Sand tiger sharks, if you ever go to aquarium, sand tiger sharks are a very common species. They have real snaggly teeth. They look real ferocious, and they look very shark-like, but they're actually very docile. They're one of the easiest sharks to keep in captivity, and they're not problematic behaviorally, but they just look fearsome. And sand tiger sharks do that. Sand tiger sharks, the young, the female lays eggs inside the uterus of the female. They then hatch, and actually sand tiger sharks, no, they ovulate their eggs, And then it's internal fertilization. So in many species of sharks, not all of them, but in many species, maybe, I think maybe it might be all of them, all species of shark have internal fertilization. Yeah, you'll often see them in aquariums, the sand tiger sharks. But sand tiger sharks, because they're ovoviviparous, leads to another really interesting thing that we see among species that are ovoviviparous. It's called, let me spell it out. Intrauterine cannibalism. I didn't spell cannibalism right. Intrauterine cannibalism. What that means, and sand tiger sharks are notorious for this, the eggs are laid inside the female, right? So then they hatch. Now, the difference that is between being viviparous and ovoviviparous is when the eggs hatch, there is no maternal investment. There's no placental interface, right? In viviparity, the typical kind of viviparity we think about, there's the placenta, and the young gains nutrients and wastes are processed by the host adult, right? In ovoviviparous, the egg is laid with a yolk sac. That's its starter pack. But once the egg hatches, then the embryo is on its own. There's no placental interface. The mother is just providing physical protection. Typically, well, not typically, but once the egg hatches in these species, then right afterwards, the young are going to be born. But the intrauterine cannibalization thing is interesting because among sand tigers, the first one who hatches in the uterus, so sand tiger sharks may have, a handful of eggs developing in the uterus. The first one who hatches eats all of his brothers and sisters in the uterus. So he actually engages in predation long before he's actually born. We always thought it was so weird that sand tiger sharks were born with one offspring. That's kind of unusual for a shark of that size and of that type, but we found out now why it is, because the oldest one eats all the other ones. So you think you got a rough world with your brothers and sisters now, you can imagine these guys. I mean, they're competing for life even before they're actually out of the uterus. Intrauterine cannibalization has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Okay, so it's all about the seeds in this chapter, and it's also going to be about other things that involved with the seeds. So let's talk a little bit about the evolutionary part first. We go back during the Carboniferous period. And remember, I mentioned to you the reason why we call it the Carboniferous is because there was, when we looked down at the rock layer that was that's that old, about 360 million years ago, there's a lot of carbon. This is where the coal deposits come from. And the reason why there's a lot of carbon during this time is during the Carboniferous period, like the dinosaur era was the era of the dinosaurs. The Carboniferous was the era of the plants. I mean, the plant was covered in plants, huge lycophytes, all kinds of plants growing all over the planet, ferns and mosses. And through time, those things died and were, buried underneath layers of sediment and compression and became coal. And that's why there's so much coal during that time, because the world was moist, there was a lot of rain. It was just perfect for plant growth. But as we talked about in the previous chapter, during the end of the Carboniferous, things start to dry out. Now, for plants, that's going to be significant, but that's also going to be significant for animals. Because at the end of the Carboniferous, when conditions begin to dry out, not everywhere, but in many parts of the world, that gave an advantage to those animals who could lay eggs and they didn't need water to do it. So the reptiles. And if you think after the Carboniferous, remember, or after this period is when we start seeing the dinosaurs. So again, it's that environment and organismal evolution. So we see this Carboniferous where it was great, all kinds of these lush forests. Things are starting to dry out at the end of the Carboniferous, and organisms are having to learn how to deal with this. Right? Now, they don't have to, right? You don't ever have to deal with a changing environment. You can simply go extinct. But obviously, that's not what we're talking about here. We're going to talk about the critters that actually did adapt. All right, so where did these first seed plants come from? Well, the first seed plants we think came from an organism, a tree in the upper right that we call a progymnosperm. Now, we'll talk about what gymnosperms are a little bit later on in the chapter, but the word excuse me, folks, I have hiccups. Give me one second. we go. I'm sorry about that. Kind of hard to speak when you got stuck on them. Oh, well, whatever. All right, so these early seed plants evolved from a spore-bearing plant, okay? So that's where we were with the seedless plants. Now, remember, again, never think that evolution is a situation where you're making things better. If things were better, if in other words, seed plants were all the rage and much better than seedless plants, evolutionarily speaking, adaptive-wise, there would be no seedless plants. And of course, there are plenty. I showed you plenty of them, right? Mosses. So it's not a matter of what's better. It's a matter of how organisms find different ways to exploit their environment. So that's what the seed plants were doing. So from an organism known as a progymnosperm, specifically the name is Archaeopteris there, this was a heterosporous but seedless plant. Heterosporous means there were male and female spores. Spores that gave rise to male and female gametophytes. You remember our fern wasn't that way. Ferns were homospores. Most ferns are homospores. When the spore germinates, you get a gametophyte. We looked at it under the microscope. It has both the male and female parts on it. Heterosporous means that one spore is going to produce the male structure that's going to produce the sperm, and the other spore, the other type of spore, is going to produce the female structure, which produces the eggs. Right? So much more on that a little bit later on when we start talking about what happened to the spores. Because I talked about in seedless plants, they have spores but no seeds. Seed plants have seeds and spores. All right, so we'll find out what happened to the spores in just a minute. But let's go back to that seed for a second. Here's what the seed does, and I've mentioned some of these kind of already. It protects the embryo. It provides food for the embryo in some cases, right? The seed actually has a starter pack, if you will, like the yolk in an egg that provides a little bit of beginning nutrition so that that offspring has a better chance to survive. Is it a 100% chance of survival? No, of course not. But it does increase your odds of survival. And remember, in the race of evolution, maybe race is not the right word, in the competition to be the fittest, you don't have to be the super fit. You just have to be more fit than the organism next to you. Evolution doesn't end up making perfect critters. What it ends up doing is making critters that do really well right now. So sometimes we say in evolution is just good enough right now. Just good enough to be a little more fit than all the other organisms around them. So protecting your embryo, providing a little bit of food for the embryo, a little bit of a starter pack. Again, most of those embryos won't make it, but that might tip the odds just a little bit. A dormancy period. Remember what I said since the beginning, it's the environment that dictates where organisms are found. It's the environment that dictates where they're found. It's the environment that dictates whether they go extinct, right? It's the environment. It's all about the environment. Now, there are ways to deal with harsh environments. You can go extinct because you can't handle it. You can adapt, right, which is evolution, or there's one more option, wait it out, right? You can have a structure that enters into a dormancy period, like the seed. So these seeds can, like those bean seeds that we've been talking about, they can go into a dormancy period, waiting for the harsh conditions of the environment to change, and then they'll germinate. Wonderful, right? Isn't that a clever kind of a loophole, if you will? I don't like the way the environment is now. I certainly don't want to go extinct. I mean, perpetuation of species is a natural drive in all living organisms. Adaptation is a choice, but I mean, at this particular point, it's a little late to adapt if the environment has changed and I haven't adapted to it. So why don't I just go into this dormant stage? So seeds, folks say, are seeds alive? They're alive, but they're kind of, oh gosh, suspended animation maybe is a way of thinking about it. They're not dead. Dead things can't come back to life, but they're not they're not metabolically active, okay? They're not metabolically active. So that would have been real important. Now, we've already talked about a structure in the seedless plants that helped them do this. Remember, that was the spores. Spores are very resistant. They make lots of spores, the mosses and the ferns, and many of them drift off, and most of them don't make it, of course. But those spores have an ability to survive harsh conditions. So if they settle down in an area that's not good right now, they can wait it out. Now, if those good conditions never come, well, the spore eventually degenerates. But some of those spores can last upwards of days, weeks, centuries in some cases. So spores can be very long-lived. Now, later on in the seed plants, not right away, but later on, we're going to add one more very significant, well, actually two more very significant structures, and that's going to be the flowers and the fruits. All right, and flowers are basically, in many species of plants, are what makes plants sexy. What I mean by that is flowers, if you use insect pollinators, are used to attract insects. All right, the flowers are the sexual part of the plant. That's where the male and female reproductive organs are. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the insects to come to the flower, give them a little bit of nectar, crawl around on the flower, get dusted with pollen, which is the male part, right? The bees have those little hairs, which aren't really hairs, of course, but all over the bee. And then the bee flies to the next flower, right? And when it's crawling around the next flower, it's dropping off the pollen from the previous flower. Everybody knows how that works. It's all about the birds and the bees. What fruits do, fruits are not made by the plant for its purposes. When a tomato plant makes a tomato, and tomato is a fruit. Anything with a seed is a fruit, folks. Anything with a seed. Cucumbers are fruits, zucchinis are fruits, anything with a seed. When that tomato plant makes that tomato, it does not make it for the tomato plant. It makes that tomato so that something will come along. I grew some tomatoes a number of years ago. What was coming along was the doggone neighborhood squirrels that were destroying my tomato plants. Something to come along like that squirrel and eat that tomato. Now, by the way, when they're eating that tomato, the seeds inside the tomato, there's lots of them, right, are being dropped, being spilled on the ground. In some cases, they might be ingested and they might travel through the digestive tract and then be dropped in a pile of fecal material, which, by the way, is great, right? Maybe not for you and me, but dropping a seed into a glob, an amount of fecal material. Why do you think that would be? Why would that be a good thing for a seed? Why would seeds find that a great environment? You know, so I eat the tomato, the seeds go in my body. I poop, and out comes the seeds along with the poop. Why seeds and poop? What's the good thing about that together? Poop is the technical term, by the way. Well, poop fertilizer, right? I mean, we use that as fertilizer. In Southeast Asia, many cases, the rice fields are fertilized by the folks who tend the field, using them as restrooms, as bathrooms. Now, that's good for the fertilizer. It's not so good for the passing of parasites. But that's what's in, you know, it's nutrients that are in poop. Just because you can't use it anymore doesn't mean that it's not nutrients that can't be used by something else. And that seed that's in the poop, oh my goodness, this is great. Nice, moist poop. It begins to germinate. All of these nutrients. You got yourself, sort of a successful, at least, beginning to that plant surviving. You've heard that one about the coffee. What's that? $350 a pound coffee that they have that has to pass through the digestive tract of a civet. A civet is a cat. This is, I believe, over in Malaysia somewhere. So it passes to the digestive system of a civet cat, and the seeds that come out the back end, the coffee beans, are then collected, and apparently there's some exquisiteness about the taste. At $350 a pound, it better taste pretty doggone good, I can tell you that much. All right, now finally look at the bottom, seed plant evolution. Thank goodness for us, because that's where we get a lot of our food. That's where a majority of the world's primary productivity comes about. In ecosystem terms, let me go back one more. Primary productivity is just a simple way of saying what the plants produce. Ecosystems have one level of primary producers, that's the plants, and then they have consumers. And you might have primary consumers, which are the herbivores, and then you might have secondary consumers, which are the carnivores or the omnivores, and it works its level from there. So there's only one level of a producer, though, right? And every ecosystem has to have the producer. You got to have somebody who can do that magic of photosynthesis. Us heterotrophs are dependent upon that ability of somebody in the ecosystem doing that for us. Forced. Ah, it's a Freudian slip. All right, terrestrial adaptations of seed plants. So let's go through some of the things that seed plants came up with, keeping in mind, once again, what I'm trying to get at here is when we're moving out onto land, terrestrial here, we're dealing with a variety of environmental pressures that would never have been encountered in organisms that live in moist conditions. Drying out, excess ultraviolet, right? The ozone layer blocks out of the UV light, so it mitigates a lot of the damage that UV light causes to organisms on Earth. It still happens. That's why you get sunburns and skin cancers from UV light. But living in water, the UV light is filtered out much more than it is living on land. So when you move on land, you've got not only the drying out, you've got the increased ultraviolet light, and ultraviolet light can be potentially damaging to genetics. No, it's all right. When an animal ingests the seeds and poops it somewhere else, yes. And the important part you said there, Savannah, was the fact that it poops it somewhere else. Yep, absolutely. So that those squirrels that were raiding my tomato plants, while they were eating that tomato, they were walking, going someplace else. And as they were dropping those seeds, some of those would have germinated, but germinated away from the parent plant. You want your young to disperse. You want them to go free into the world. Don't we know what we tell our kids? In a biological level, it's very simple. Get away from me. I don't want to share resources. I've done what I can for you, okay? I got you the seed. I got you a starter pack. Here you go. The rest is you. Don't grow underneath me. I don't want you stealing my resources. Move away. Trees and other animals don't have quite the affinity for their children that perhaps we do. Although it's always nice when our children move away too, right? Yeah, good question. I like that. All right, so let's look at seeds. Let's look at this gametophyte, okay? Let's look what happened to the gametophyte. Now, let me remind you once again, when we look at a moss, walking through the woods, oh, there's a moss, and you see that big green mat of moss, you're looking at the gametophyte. You're looking at the multicellular structure that is haploid. If it's a gametophyte, it's haploid because it makes gametes. Okay, and it makes gametes through mitosis. That's the quantity part. The gametophyte was produced or came out of a germinating spore. The sporophytes, those little tiny things that grow up the top of the mosses that we looked at, that's the diploid part. All right? What we're going to talk about today as we move into these plants is how the prominence of the gametophyte and the sporophyte change. I use the word the dominant generation, and again, it's not a behavioral thing, but among the seedless plants, among the mosses, the dominant generation was the gametophyte. Dominant being it's the most conspicuous, it's the biggest. The sporophyte were those little tiny wispy things. They're only around for a little bit of time. The only reason the sporophytes were created in moss was to mix the gametes together, shuffle up the genetic information, go through meiosis, make some more variable spores, and spread them out, make some more gametophytes. It's all about the gametophytes with these guys. Now, remember in the ferns, the gametophyte got smaller, not as conspicuous, right? It's hard to find the gametophyte. There was that little thing on a slide that had the male and the female, the Antheridia and the Archegonia. It looked like a heart, the gametophyte. The sporophyte was the leaf or the frond of the fern. So we say as we move from mosses to ferns, the dominant generation shifts. In mosses, it's the gametophyte. In ferns, it's the sporophyte. Now, that dominance of the sporophyte continues into the seed plants that you're familiar with, trees and bushes. What you look at when you're looking at a tree is you're looking at the sporophyte. So again, remember I told you there are still spores produced in these organisms. The gametophyte is there, but it's reduced. It's reduced, it's microscopic, and it's retained inside of the parent plant. It's being protected. All right, it's being protected. So what we're doing here is we're putting more protection into the reproductive aspects of these organisms and focusing less on numbers. The gametophyte of a moss is a very sensitive structure, but mosses get away from it because they make big gametophytes. Numbers. It's all about numbers. We'll also talk about the different types of spores, the heterospory, the fact that they're a male, if you will, male and female spores. Then we'll talk about the naughty bits of these plants. We'll talk about what we call the ovules, which is the female part, where the seeds are, where the ovary is found, and then the pollen, which it being this time of year, if you have allergies, you're very familiar. This is the male part. The pollen is the male part. That's where the male gametophyte, or the male, or the sperm is found. All right, so let's take a look at seeds again first. All right. Seeds develop from ovules, all right? Ovules are found inside the ovary, and that's what produces the seeds, okay? The embryo in a seed is protected by the covering of the seed, or what we call the integument. Integument is like your skin is called integument. So here we go. We have a seed coat. There's protection, right? It's kind of like the coating around the pollen. Remember I said the coating around the pollen was pretty durable as well. Well, seeds, especially if they're going to wait around till the conditions get better, they're going to have a protective outer coating. All right. Now the integument is sporophyte tissue. Sporophyte tissue. It's important you understand that, because what is inside of that seed is going to be where the gametes mix, but it's surrounded by the sporophyte. It's surrounded by the host adult plant, and then of course that eventually hardens into the seed coat, which is the protective part. So you can see in the picture on the right, on the top, there's the little embryo. There's the little bit of the stored food, right? Little starter pack. And then, of course, the integument that I just talked about. These right here are going to eventually become the leaves. This is going to grow down and form the roots. And this is going to grow up and form the shoots. So you got the shoots growing up and the roots growing down. Now, in some species, there's a little bit of what's called an endosperm. Now, endosperm, that's the food supply for the embryo. This is what I said, the dispersal starter pack. When you had popcorn, look down in the lower right, the corn kernel. In a corn kernel, if you cut it open, there's the embryo, the cotyledon. A cotyledon. What is a cotyledon? A cotyledon is an embryonic leaf. It's the first leaf or leaves that form. So in this seed up here, this one had 2 cotyledons, right? 2 embryonic leaves, one there and one there. Some plants have 2 cotyledons. We call them dicots. And some have 1 embryonic leaf, and they're called monocots. All right, now we'll talk more about monocots and dicots later on. All right, but look in that corn kernel again. Most of the corn kernel is endosperm, and that's food. When you make popcorn, the white part, when it pops, that's endosperm. That's starch. That's food. That's sugars. That's carbohydrates. That's the little food starter pack that seeds provide from that developing embryo. A little bit of an endosperm. Now, that doesn't happen at all, but it is one of the major evolutionary innovations that we see, especially in flowering plants that produce fruits, which we'll get to after we get through the pine plants. Spores are dormant, but seeds, like I said, can be dormant a lot longer too. And also seeds are very good for being dispersed as well. So not only do you have the idea of the fruit being consumed by something, right, and then being dispersed, but like for example, in some cases the seeds are dispersed by wind. Poor old Cooper. Cooper's very familiar with sand burrs and beggar ticks, things that stick to your fur. If you have fur, things that stick to you. That would be, you'd be transporting that. The maple down there below has those little winged-like seeds. That's really good in the wind. They flow. The wind pushes them around. Lotus water plants, plants that live near the water, like the coconut, cattails. They're going to have seeds that do well floating, and that's going to be their dispersal. You can throw them out bursting, like violets or witch hazel. The seeds actually, kind of like the springs in the sporophytes that we were looking at earlier. It's really neat when these seeds are shot out, so you get them away from the parent. The last one is by humans or things that would eat these. That's what they're basically, right? So there's a cherry. You leave the cherry pit somewhere, and then that grows into a cherry tree. This also has to do with humans, about how we've spread this stuff throughout the planet, okay? So seeds, really good for dispersal. a nice little starter pack of food to give that embryo, that developing embryo, a chance to survive. Now, let's go here. What happened to the gametophyte? The gametophyte is still there. As I said, now the dominant generation is the sporophyte. When you're looking at a pine tree or you're looking at an oak tree, you're looking at the sporophyte. So let's figure out what happened to the gametophyte. Well, the gametophyte is a more sensitive structure. It's a structure that's going to need to be protected. So we're going to make it smaller and smaller. Now, we already saw that, right, when we looked at the ferns. So this little chart here is a review of it. We've been here already, and here's where we're going today. So we started off with the gametophyte being dominant and the sporophyte being that. This is a haircap moss, right? Not only is the sporophyte small and not as conspicuous, but it's also dependent upon the gametophyte. It can't live independently. It can't survive. It needs to get food from it. When we move into the ferns, there's that little gametophyte that we were talking about, the thing that was on the microscope slide. That was a gametophyte. So the gametophyte in ferns is really small, inconspicuous, so now the dominant generation is the sporophyte, the diploid generation. And then today we're going to move into the pine trees and into the flowering plants, and the same trend continues. The gametophyte continues to get smaller in each one of those, so much that it's reduced usually down to microscopic size. You know, the gametophyte in the fern, you had to look at it under a microscope to see the Antheridia and Archegonia, but you could see it if you held up the slide. What we're talking about in these gymnosperms and angiosperms, gymnosperms are the pines, basically, and angiosperms are the flowering plants. We're talking about the fact that we have shrunk down the gametophyte to the point, retained inside the host sporophyte for protection, but we've shrunk it down to the point of being microscopic. So the female gametophyte, which has been shrunk down to microscopic side, is found inside in the pine trees. It's found inside the ovulate cone. Now, when you think of a pine tree and the pine cone, usually the pine cone, you think of the bigger ones. Those are the ovulate cones. There's a chance to use my camera. I got a little pine, but there's an ovulate cone. See that one right there? That's an ovulate cone. That's a female cone. There is also a male cone, one you might not be as familiar with. Now, whether they're male or female, the gametophyte, male or female gametophyte, is going to be microscopic inside. But the pollen cone is right, I don't know how well you can see that, at the tip of the branches. You see those little, oh man, there's needles falling all over the place here. You see those structures right there? There we go. Can you guys see that? Yeah. Those are the male cones. Male cones are found at the end of the branch, whereas or what we would call the pollen cones, by the way, or the staminate cones, another name for it. Are going to be found at the ends of the branches, whereas the ovulate cones are going to be found a little bit further up the branches. Now, in this particular case, it's another chance for me to introduce another term to you. When an organism has both the male and the female sex organs, now, not hermaphrodite, we're not talking about someone who has ambiguous sex organs, but we're talking about having both sex organs on there, we say that that organism, it helps if I'm actually in the chat box, is monoecious. Monoecious means literally one house. Monoecious means one organism, one tree, one pine tree, has both the pollen male cones and the female ovulate cones on one tree. A difference than that, there are some species that we'll talk about in which the sexes are separate, like you and I, right? There's a separate male, a separate female. Those critters are considered dioecious. Two houses, male and female. Not male and female in separate entities, right? See what I mean? So pine trees have the female ovulate cones on the same tree as the male pollen cone, so that makes them monoecious. Same thing with the flowering plants. Not in all flowers, but in many flowers, both the male and the female parts are found on the same flower. This one. This is a knockout rose that I've torn the petals off. And I'm sorry, I don't know how well you can see what I'm trying to show you here. There we go. See all the little things sticking up? Those are all the male parts. And then if I turn it to face you, if you can see right inside the yellow, see the yellow little dot in the middle? Those are the female parts. So this flower has both the male and the female. So this plant, these knockout roses, would be monoecious. Now, there are some flowering plants that have male and female flowers. They would be then dioecious, okay? Either you're monoecious or dioecious, it doesn't matter. The same thing has happened. That gametophyte has been reduced. It's dependent upon the sporophyte now for protection. It's dependent on the sporophyte for nutrition, but it means there's a better chance of the offspring surviving because they're giving a little bit more of a head start than we see like in the mosses and the other plants out there as well. And again, I've reminded you that the big thing that's going on here with these land plants is having to deal with drying out, protection from ultraviolet light, and again, the idea that the sporophyte gives you a little bit of a start, a little bit of a help. Okay? Now, there are no plant mommies out there taking care of their offspring, but this is kind of a, while I'm really distorting the word or kind of not twisting the word, but this is kind of maternal care in plants, maybe. I find that interesting because animals did the same thing, right? Along the animal, we're going to talk about as we go through the animal evolution, we see kind of a same kind of trend. This idea of less offspring, more paternal care. All right, any questions on that? That's what happened to the gametophyte. It's there, but it's microscopic. We'll be able to take a look at it in the lab too. Heterospory, the idea that the spores are different, right? All right, let's take a look. Seed plants are heterosporous. I got some terminology. Now, here's another picture of some pollen cones. I took this picture. I'm sorry it's not in focus. When I first had my camera on my phone and I was taking these pictures, I was always getting back to house going, why are the damn things always out of focus? And my wife says, do you have your glasses on when you're taking the picture? Well, that could be it. Anyway, these are male cones of a longleaf pine. Again, at the tip of the branches. Now, I'll show you in just a second the significance of why the male cones are at the tip and the ovulate cones are not. But these are male cones right here. All right, now let's look at some terminology here. When we're talking about the female gamete in many organisms, including ourselves, by the way, is usually bigger. Eggs are bigger than sperm. So we use the word to refer to the female gamete, we use the root mega. Doesn't mean it's big, but it's big relatively speaking, okay? So, using the terms that we've talked about before, sporangium. In seed plants, a megasporangium, which is a megaspore-producing structure. Remember in the, let's keep the terms, equate the terms. You remember in the sporophyte, in the moss, that thing at the tip was a sporangium. Things that make spores are called sporangia or sporangium. So megasporangium are found on megasporophylls. All right, now that might be a word you're not familiar with. A megasporophyll is a modified leaf. Everything in plants that we're going to be talking about here, the pine cones that you find on pine trees, the flowers that you find on flowering plants, and a variety of other things that don't have to do with reproduction are modifications of leaves. That's what plants did. Plants modified their leaves into all these special structures. So a megasporophyll is a modified leaf that contains the megasporangium. In the megasporophyll, by meiosis, inside the ovule, they produce haploid megaspores, which produces eggs. All right, now all that, megasporangium, megasporophyll, ovules, megaspore. In the pine tree, all of that is happening on an ovulate cone. So the ovulate cone, the bigger cone, would be a megasporophyll. That ovulate, this cone right here, this is a female cone right there. There we go. That is a megasporophyll. These little scales that you see right here, the seeds that are going to form, this is a pine seed. There you go. It's got that little wing. Now, I don't know how well you'll see this, but I will show you in the lab. Actually lays on top of the scales, right? So that little seed is laying on top of the scales there, and when the wind comes along, I don't know if you saw that seed, but the seed gets blown out and then disperses. The wing is just the wing. The youngin is the lump at the end. See, that's the seed. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if you're in the pollen cones or you're in the male cones, it's all about small. So it's microsporangium on microsporophylls. These are microsporophylls. And by meiosis in pollen cones, they produce haploid microspores, which makes pollen grains. Okay. Enough of the sporangium and micro and mega. It's just basically looking at the relative size of those two. So the male gametophytes, the pollen grains, usually in these organisms are going to be dispersed in or a pollinator. No need for water. Remember the ferns and the mosses, the sperm were flagellated. They were flagellated because they needed water. They swim through the little droplets from the antheridia to the archegonium. That's not a problem here. You're not going to depend on water because you're living in an environment which there isn't surrounded by water. All right, so here's a pine ovule. So here is a pine tree female cone. And you can see that it contains the gametophyte. There it is. There's the archegonia right there. There's actually two archegonia. This whole thing then is the female gametophyte. This is all sporophyte tissue. And inside of that, again, is that microscopic female gametophyte. Same thing in pollen grains. In the blue, these are pollen grains. The little sacs you see are oftentimes filled with air, helps them float, trying to disperse. But the male gametophyte, which is microscopic, is contained inside those pollen grains. So we don't have a little sporophyte thing sticking up anymore, right? We have things that are remaining microscopic inside of the developing adult plant. It's all about survival, right? All right, any questions on any of that? We'll reinforce this a lot in lab when we start looking at the different slides pertaining to these as well. Let's now turn our attention to ovules, the female part, and pollen, the male part. All right, let's look at an ovule. An ovule is made up of three basic parts. It has a megasporangium, right? That's the thing that produces the megaspores. It has megaspores, and then it's got this integument protection, right? That's the sporophyte tissue. In angiosperms, which are flowering plants, there's actually two layers of sporophyte tissue. Really want to protect that embryo, right? So take a look over here on the left-hand side. We're basically following the fertilization of an egg by a sperm. Now the egg is called the megaspore, right? Notice that the megaspore, because it's the reduced gametophyte, is haploid. Notice the integument around it, which is the parent plant, is diploid. All right, so that's sporophyte in brown surrounding the gametophyte, which is found inside that megaspore. Now that megaspore is inside a megasporangium, right? That's what produced it. Down at the bottom, there's a little tiny hole called a micropyle. Right? Now through that micropyle, a pollen grain with a sperm, is going to enter in through the micropyle. And when it does, then it's going to fertilize the egg. And upon fertilization of that egg, we're going to get the developing embryo, along with the food supply. See, there's a food supply on the right-hand side. That little starter pack. So from the microspore, we get what we call a pollen grain. Now, technically, the pollen grain is the gametophyte and the pollen wall, right? The pollen wall, by the way, which is covered by that really durable stuff called sporopollenin. Again, you want to protect that. You're protecting that very sensitive male or female gametophyte. Okay, in botany, it's important to know the distinction between these two things. Pollination and fertilization are two different things. An organism can be pollinated but not fertilized. Pollination means the pollen makes it to the female part of the plant, right? When the pollen gets there by either an insect or wind. Fertilization is the same definition from Bio 1. It's when sperm and egg fuse. What we mean by separating those terms is that sometimes pollination occurs and fertilization occurs much later. So they're not simultaneous. You don't get pollination and fertilization exactly at the same time necessarily. Okay, any questions on that? That's kind of an overview of what seed plants came up with to survive these harsh conditions. These dry, heavy ultraviolet light, very much different than the conditions you find in the ocean. If you think about living in water, it's pretty cushy, isn't it, right? You're always wet. You don't have to worry about drying out. Sunlight, for the most part, is shaded, if you will. The water is really good at dealing with changes in the chemistry because it can dilute it. These are things that are challenges for organisms when they move on land, whether they're plants or animals. And we're seeing their responses to that, right? Going to keep that. Now, the gametophyte, as I said, is the delicate part. Remember, it's the haploid. It's only got one set of genetic information. When we're dealing with the world, having genetic information is your key to survival. So haploid cells only have half the amount of genetic information. Diploid cells have twice the amount, right? So if you are going to deal with these harsh environmental conditions, having access to more of a genetic library, that might be an advantage. Is it the only way to go? No, of course not. Plenty of haploid structures out there survive. Mosses do really well, don't they? There's plenty of mosses around. So for them, being haploid works really well where they live. Where they live. Living in other conditions, drier conditions, and deserts, you're not going to find a lot of those haploid gametophyte dominant organisms. You're going to find more of these guys that are protecting that gametophyte. Sporophytes are stronger. Diploid refers to the fact that you got two sets of genetic information that you can deal with changes that might be occurring. Remember, that's all about the genetic information and heredity being passed on. It's still all about evolution. Okay, let's take a look at the plants in general. We've gone through the mosses, the ferns, and the green algae. We've talked about those. So today we're going to be talking about gymnosperms and angiosperms. These are what we call sister clades, so clades that arose basically at about the same time. So again, it's not a matter of gymnosperms gave rise to angiosperms. You can see in the chart, and we don't know if it was exactly at the same time, but it was pretty close to the same time these two organisms arose on the scene. Very dominant during the dinosaur era. The Mesozoic is the dinosaur era, anywhere from about 250 million years ago up until 65 million years ago. The climate was drying after the Carboniferous. Plants were moving out into drier environments. So were animals, especially reptiles who could deal with dry climates. They needed something to eat, and guess what was there? A lot of these gymnosperms and these angiosperms. Now, the gymnosperms were the more prominent, dominant's not really the word I want to use there, but they were the more prominent for a long period of time. After the dinosaurs died off at the end of the Mesozoic, then the flowering plants, the angiosperms, actually begin the more dominant plant. More conspicuous, more obvious, more widespread. Angiosperms were around back during the dinosaurs. It's kind of like I told you the other day that mammals were around back during the dinosaurs. They just weren't. They weren't dominant. It was the dinosaurs that were dominant. So let's look at the gymnosperms first. Now, a little bit of root word here. In science, gymno means naked. Okay. And sperm in this case refers to seed. And I know you're thinking seed is more than just the sperm, but just kind of in a rough way. So a gymnosperm refers to a naked seeded plant. Naked seed. Yes. This seed right here is naked. There's nothing covering it. Now, if you're thinking, what does he mean covering it? Let me give you the contrast. Angiosperm, angio means container. So this is a seed in a container. What are they talking about? Angiosperms have fruit. The fruit is the container. The fruit is what makes you naked or not. Pine trees don't make fruits, right? Think about the tomato again. Open up the tomato, cut open a tomato, see the seeds inside. All right, that's this thing, that's the seed, but it's surrounded by a fruit, and it's not the same way in the pine tree. So gymnosperms have naked seeds, no fruit. Angiosperms have seeds that are in a container. They're surrounded by a fruit for reasons that we talked about earlier, right? It's all about encouraging organisms to come along and disperse you. So let's look at gymnosperms. The gymnosperms are pine tree, cypress, cedar, like you see in the background there. A lot of those are a bunch of cypress trees. Very, very common stuff that we see around here. As I said, the seeds are exposed. They're not surrounded by the fruit or what the fruit came from. The fruit of a plant is the ovary of that plant. Now, they have an ovary, but the ovary doesn't surround the seeds in gymnosperms. All right, or fruit. I'm sorry, let me say that again. Gymnosperms have an ovary. It doesn't develop into a fruit in gymnosperms, okay? Most species of gymnosperms are conifers. Conifers are pines, pine trees. There are other things that are not gymnosperms that we'll go through, but the ones that you think mostly about are pines and cedar. Again, no flowers, no fruits. No flowers, no fruits. The picture you're seeing on the right there is a cross section to a pine cone. And I was just, in this picture, I'm trying to show you what I showed you in the camera a second ago. This is the scale of the cone. And if you look, that little sliver where it says SD, that's the seed that's laying on top of the scale. Right, so that's this thing right here, the seed. And that seed is laying, as you can see in the picture, right on top of the scale. So when the pine cone opens up, the wind blows through and blows the seeds out and disperses them. About 600 species of conifers, which is the most prominent type of gymnosperm, and what, about another 200 species. So you're talking about around 800 species of gymnosperms, 250,000 angiosperms. Right away, it tells you that obviously these are the most prominent ones. These are the ones that did the best. I guess maybe best is not the right word, but they're the ones that diversified the most. Okay. All right. Gymnosperms. Conifers. Most familiar phylum. Pines, spruces, firs, cedar, coastal redwoods, the tallest living vascular plant, by the way. That's not me. This is some dude standing next to a coastal redwood, but you can do 200-300 feet. Bristlecone pines. There's bristlecone pines. Those seeds are also tasty things for animals to eat. So bristlecone pines add a little measure of defense to kind of dissuade you. Those little prickles on the outside of the cone to try to dissuade you from eating the seeds that are found there. This is a bristlecone pine. This is the one of the oldest living trees. These can be on the order of thousands of years old. This is a longleaf pine. This is a Florida longleaf. Okay. And of course the cones, which are dominant, are found in this group. We usually find members of this phylum, Coniferophyta, the conifers, we usually find them in cooler, drier climates, which might seem a little bit odd to you considering all the pines we have down here. And we're anything but cool and dry, right? Well, cooler, drier climates, pines also can do well in climates in which the soils are nutrient deficient. In other words, soils that don't have a lot of supporting nutrients in them. You might think, looking in Florida, well, is that the case in our soil? Yeah, our soil is pretty nutrient deficient. As a matter of fact, the soil in the tropical rainforest, where all that stuff grows, the soil is pretty nutrient deficient down there. Kind of seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? If the soil is so nutrient deficient, how do we get this massive growth that we see, in Florida and certainly in the tropical regions? The reason why is because of the growth. The soil is nutrient deficient in these areas because growth is so fast, right? Tropical rainforests are perfect for plants growing. Man, it's moist. There's plenty of sun. Great place for plants to grow. Because those plants grow so fast, things that die and fall over and begin to decompose and their nutrients are returned back to the soil, there's so many growing things, those nutrients are sucked up really fast. So you see what I'm saying? The soils are nutrient deficient because most of the nutrients are up in the living things. There's not a lot of decomposing nutrients going on. Decomposition rates in areas of the world like here in the tropical rainforest are very fast. Things to decompose very quickly and are very quickly recycled back to living organisms in the area. In Florida, we have nutrient deficient soil, so our pines or pines do well down here. Species of pines do well down here, not because of that. The tough needle-like clusters with the thick cuticle, that helps them retard water loss. Is that a problem in Florida? Losing water? It rains a lot, but it gets pretty damn hot too. It's pretty warm, and the heat could cause plants to lose moisture. So this thick cuticle on their needles, right, helps them kind of retain some of that water. Now, being evergreen, this is really an advantage up north. If you're evergreen, in other words, if you're the opposite of this, deciduous, trees that lose their leaves in the winter, right, like up north, evergreens don't. That's why they're called evergreens. You can photosynthesize all year round. Even in the dead of winter up north, where there's just a little bit of sun showing, these plants can still continue to photosynthesize, whereas the deciduous ones, they've lost their leaves. They're going to photosynthesize in the spring, but they can't photosynthesize in the winter. And also, by the way, speaking of spring, when spring comes, guess who's ready to photosynthesize right away? The evergreens, right? The deciduous plants have to grow their leaves back before they can photosynthesize. So the evergreens are ready to ripping and roaring as soon as the environment turns to spring and things start really picking up. Pine trees, of course, are important for us, right? We use them for a lot of reasons: timber, paper, resin, Taxol, which is an ingredient that's extracted from conifers that has anti-cancer properties. And in modern medicine, that's kind of what we're for now, is much more research or emphasis on finding herbal or natural remedies because of the lack of side effects. We have to keep that in mind sometimes when we're cutting down forests and trees. We might be removing genetic or biological resources that we don't even know about, like in the case of some of the medical resources. All right, any questions on that? Those are the conifers. Let's take a look at how conifers reproduce, keeping in mind that it is, again, alternation of generation. There is that multicellular diploid and multicellular haploid. But let's start over here with the sporophyte. Okay, so here we are on the sporophyte. It's monoecious, so it's got male and female cones on it. Let's follow the female cone first. So let's follow the top part. Female cones have an ovule, and in an ovule there's a megasporocyte. A megasporocyte is the cell that's going to give rise to the megaspore, right? Inside of the megasporocyte is going to be the megasporangium. Now, let's follow just with the female. The female cone is going to undergo, or the megasporocyte is going to undergo meiosis. Now, when it undergoes meiosis, it's going to produce 4 surviving megaspores, 4 of them, because that's what meiosis does, right? Meiosis 1, meiosis 2. I'm not talking about polar bodies, any of that. So you get 4 of them. Now, you get 4 of them, 3 of them disintegrate, and only 1 is left. That one divides by mitosis 3 times. Divides by mitosis 3 times, ends up producing 8 cells. Now, we'll get back to that in just a moment. We'll look at that a little more closely. The eggs are found, of course, as we talked about in the mosses, in the archegonium. There's the female gametophyte, microscopic. So that little female gametophyte is inside that little seed right there that we're looking at. So that little brown thing that you're looking at right there is one of these little seeds that's forming, okay? All right, so we get fertilization. There are 2 archegonia and 2 eggs. Both eggs get fertilized, but only one typically develops. Why not fertilize both of them? Why not fertilize both of them? Maybe there's something wrong with the other one and it won't develop. Maybe there's nothing, maybe they're both okay, so one's going to develop faster than the other. Either way, that's fine. One of those is going to develop, and that's going to form the new embryo, the new sporophyte, with some food reserves. And there they are. This is the scale of the pine cone. And then you can see the seeds. There are two of them on each scale, the two seeds that are forming. And, of course, they'll go out and find their way to, hopefully, an environment, become a seedling. Same thing's happening on the male end with the microsporangium, right? They undergo meiosis. Now, they don't undergo meiosis and then get rid of one of them, but they basically undergo meiosis and produce all these pollen grains with the male gametophyte inside. And that male gametophyte in that pollen grain's got to make its way over to the female so it can fertilize the egg. Ovulate cones very often will develop over 2 seasons too. In season 1, they open up and they allow themselves to be pollinated. Then the scales will close again. So when I'm talking about scales, I'm talking about these parts of the pine cone here. These are the scales. So then they'll close again. And then during season 2, the female gametophyte and the male gametophyte will get together and we'll get basically fertilization. So what happens, it takes a while. This is what I mean about pollination and fertilization not being the same thing. You can have 15 months, over a year, between the time the pollen reached the ovulate cone and the actual male and female gametophyte were united in the archegonium. Remember, the pollen tube, the tube contains the male gametophyte, the male gamete. All right. Now we'll look at these in the in lab under the microscope, but just kind of as an introduction, we'll go ahead and set the framework. Pinus is the genus. Microstrobilus. Strobilus is a cone, so this is the male cone. This is the pollen cone, or sometimes called the staminate cone. Staminate, male, pollen cone, all the same thing. Inside of that, there are microsporangium. The microsporophylls, again, are the little leaves that they form on in the male cones. Inside of those are the microsporangium, which are producing the microspores, which are producing the pollen grains, which look like that. Okay, so all those little blue dots are pollen. Look how many there are. About numbers, right? Amazing. Here's the female side of it. The megasporangium, I should have wrote the megasporophyll, the scale, and then the ovule, which is the seed right there. So you're going to have to get pollen from here. It's going to have to make its way to fertilize one of the eggs or both of the eggs in the archegonia that's found in the seed. No easy task, right? Okay, so that's the conifers. Let's look at some other gymnosperms. Cycads, all right? Cycads, we talked about that the other day in class. You do have to have a cycad-free field notebook. This is a queen sago palm. I don't mind if you use that one, even though it is not a native species. Cycads have very large cones. This is a cycad male cone. This is a cycad female cone. Now, this female cone, to be fair, is also ripe. All those little red things are seeds that have been formed. Very large cones. Dioecious. So this is found on one plant. This is found on the other plant. They're not on the same plant. Sago palms, right? Remember the common name like Spanish moss? You have to be careful with. They're called palms, but they're not really palms. They have leaves like palms, but they're not palms. Now you help me for a second. Why do their leaves look like palm leaves even though they're not palms? What's that in evolution when that happens? You got organisms that aren't closely related to one another, but they end up kind of looking like one another. What do we call that? There you go. Thank you. Convergent evolution, right? Gotta be careful with that. Cycads have the notoriety of having the largest flagellated sperm of all organisms. Well, look at that. There's a medal for you. Very dominant during the dinosaur period. Most of them are endangered now. Most of them are gone. As a matter of fact, down below there's a little picture you can see of the size of a cycad sperm. There's a cycad sperm on the right. This is the size of a grain of table salt in the dust mites. That's a pretty good sized sperm, right? You could see it with the naked eye. You can see a grain of salt with the naked eye. Couldn't see human sperm with the naked eye. Dioecious, male, female. This is a pollen cone, so that's the male. This is an immature female. And when her ovules are fertilized, when her seeds are fertilized and she starts developing young, those are the seeds right there. These cones here come from this palm. This is one of our native Florida palms. This is which cycad is that, Daniela? Do you remember? What's the name of that cycad there on the left? I had you go scrounge around on campus. Yeah, that's the Cooney palm, or arrowroot. There are some of those, a lot of those behind the Student Services building. All right, so that's cycad. Oh, look at this group. What a weird group of plants. These are still gymnosperms, naked seeds. These are gnetophytes. The G is silent. Tropical, live in the desert. This is Weltwichia, this one you see in the background. Weltwichia, I believe, is South African, is where you find most of it. They actually do have cones, little ovulate cones, so pretty much like similar to the pine trees. There's only one species of Weltwichia. There's not a lot of gnetophytes around, honestly. Long-lived, though, some cases thousands of years. Ephedra, down here in the bottom, this is ephedra. Ephedra has ephedrine. What is ephedrine? Anybody know what ephedrine is or does, or what it can do? It's a stimulant. Ephedrine's a stimulant. It's like caffeine, basically. Ephedra down there in the lower left, that's the one we find. That's the only one we find in North America. That's the only gnetophyte that we find in North America. Ephedra goes by a common name, Mormon's tea. Strict Mormons shy away from any sort of stimulant, so they don't tobacco or alcohol or coffee. They don't drink coffee because of caffeine. But many Mormons get around that by drinking Mormon's tea, which is made out of ephedra, which has ephedrine, which is also a stimulant. So yes, you're technically not drinking caffeine, but you're still consuming a stimulant. Netum. Netum is kind of cool because even though netum is a naked seeded plant, a gymnosperm, right, without any fruits, if you look at this is down here on the right, netum has seeds that are almost like fruits. Not quite fruits, but almost like fruits. So again, the idea that organisms, when we look at evolution, organisms tend to experiment with different ways. Now, obviously, the fruited plants that we'll talk about later on, they took this to the next level. But you can already see among these naked seeded plants this idea of making a fruit. Again, something to entice organisms to come and mess with your seeds, to eat them, to drop them around, to disperse them. The last naked seeded plant, my favorite of all time, is the ginkgo. Ginkgo biloba. There's only one species around today. They were a lot more prominent many years ago, mostly during the dinosaur, but now we only have one, Ginkgo biloba. Don't have them down here in Florida. They're found, well, a lot of them are found in Indianapolis. I go to a conference in Indianapolis a couple of times the last few years, and I always see lots of ginkgo. They're Asian and their native homeland or native habitat is Asia, but they were brought to the United States many years ago and planted along main streets because they're real pretty. They're called maidenhair trees. You can see the yellow one there. They turn yellow certain times of the year, and they're very pretty lining up and down the tree, down the Main Street, USA kind of thing. They're also really tolerant to air pollution, which was another reason. But flagellated sperm, that means they got to make their way from one to the other, you know, through the water droplets. A lot of municipalities, a lot of cities, a lot of towns went back later and cut down all their ginkgos because the seeds. You see in the picture, that's that picture I took up in Indianapolis. There's the ginkgo leaves, but the seeds, the big white things, are the seeds. It's not a fruit, that's a big seed. And when they decompose, they stink. They smell, well, they smell basically like vomit is what they smell like. So what would happen in these areas is these seeds would drop during times of the year, and then it was like, ugh, can't stand the stink, right? No other plant, no other leaf on earth looks like the ginkgo. The leaf shape, the venation is all very distinctive. It's really kind of funny. My wife brought home a serving dish, a white ceramic serving dish that she bought. She goes, look at this really cool serving dish I bought. And she goes, you got to get it. It's got a name for it written on the back. And I said, what, ginkgo? She goes, how would you know that? Well, the serving dish she was showing me was shaped like a ginkgo leaf. So I was like, yes, because there are plants out there called ginkgos. And she didn't know that I knew that. So there. Where are we? Oh, we still got some time. Let's start with the angiosperms. All right, let's start with the container-seeded plants, the big group, 250,000 species, about 90% of all plants. The big thing here is flowers and fruit. Okay, flowers again, which are just like cones, are modified stems, modified leaves, you know, modifications of the basic structures of plants. Now the seed is covered though. Covered by a fruit. Look at the tomato down there. See the seeds? Notice that they're covered by a fruit. The fruit comes from something called the carpel. Now, I'll show you what a carpel is as we go through our lecture here, but it's the carpel. Inside the carpel are the seeds, and the whole carpel becomes the fruit. The layers you see there, the mesocarp and the exocarp, are just the layers of the carpel. The exocarp is that thin tomato skin, and the mesocarp is the stuff on the inside. But again, anything with a seed is a fruit. A covered seed is an angiosperm fruit. Fruits, flowers, all right? Flowers in flowering plants are organized into things we call whorls. A whorl is a circular arrangement. There is a whorl of sepals. I've torn them all off of here. The sepal is the little green part that looks like a petal, but it's green below the actual colored petals, which is the next part. There is the male part of the flower, which is oftentimes in a whorl. That's called the androecium. The androecium includes the stamen, and the stamen is made up of the anther and the filament. The anther is where the pollen is produced. So pollen is produced at the tips of these filaments in anthers. Together, a group of stamen, and flowers sometimes will have many stamens, sometimes will only have one, collectively is called the androecium. The female parts are the gynoecium. If you have troubles, remember the difference between the two. Remember that females go to a gynecologist, right? The gynoecium is the female part, and it's made up of something called the carpel. We just saw that term. Remember, so the carpel is what becomes the fruit. The carpel includes the stigma at the top, a style, and down at the bottom, the ovary with the ovules, the seeds inside. The stigma has a really cool name because the stigma is sticky. Pollen is going to stick to the stigma, then it's going to travel down the style until it eventually fertilizes one of the seeds in the ovule. Now, I've taken one of the flowers out on the nature trail, and I've removed all the male parts, and all I've got here is the carpel. See if you can, how well that is. Do you see that? See, at the top is the stigma, the long white structure is the style, and at the bottom, the green thing, that's the ovary. Now, if this were a plant that would make a prominent fruit, it would be the style and the stigma erode and are gone. This is the part that becomes the fruit. Flowers can either be radially symmetrical. Radially symmetrical means that no matter where you cut a line, you cut it in equal halves. Bilaterally symmetrical, like you and I, we have a left and a right. Flowers can be what we call complete. That is, they have both sex organs, the carpel and the stamen, or they can be incomplete. Like in this one, this is the male flower, and this is the female flower. And that varies from species to species. Most flowers in this group are complete, though. It's 3:20. That's a good place to stop. I only have a few more slides left. We'll come back and finish those up next week. So, anybody have any questions for me? Remember, you do have your exam next week, right? Chapters 27 and 28, prokaryotes and protozoans, or prokaryotes and protozoans. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's what it is. All right, folks. If you don't have any questions, that's all I have for today. Have a good weekend. Work on your field notebooks, and I will see you guys next Monday.